Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, it's time for one of the most interesting sessions of the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival 2022, the Knowledge Mahakumbh of India. This session is titled as Savarkar, a Contested Legacy, and we have a person who holds renowned reputation in the field of literature and history. As the author, we have Vikram Sampath ji. I would request all of us to please invite him on stage with a round of applause. Vikram Sampath ji will be in conversation with Tejasvi Nayak ji and Dr Sandeep Shastri ji. मैं उन्हें भी तालियों के साथ मंच पर आमंत्रित करना चाहूँगा. तीनों महान हस्तियों को बुलाना चाहूँगा मंच पर. Tejasvi Nayak ji and Dr Sandeep Shastri ji as discussants. The Bangalore-based historian Dr. Vikram Sampath ji is the author of 6 acclaimed books. His latest books are the 2-volume biography Savarkar, Echoes from a Forgotten Past, and Savarkar, a Contested Legacy from Penguin Random House, India, both of which have gone on to become national bestsellers. That calls for an applause, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Sampath was recently elected as the Fellow of UK's prestigious Royal Historical Society. He was also awarded the Sahitya Academy's first Yuva Puraskar in English Literature and the ARSC International Award for Excellence in Historical Research in New York for his book on Gohar Jan. Dr. Sampath was among the 4 writers and artists to be selected as a writer in residence at the Rashtrapati Bhavan in 2015. As the discussants, we are delighted to have Tejasvi Nayak ji. And we are also delighted to have Dr. Sandeep Shastri ji. He is a political scientist and currently is the Vice Chancellor of Jagran Lake City University, author of a book on Lal Bahadur Shastri. Dr. Sandeep ji specializes in the study and analysis of Indian politics with a special focus on elections. He is a consultant to the United Nations, World Bank, and the Forum of Federations. Dr. Shastri has delivered lectures in over 50 countries, and that is certainly inspiration for all of us here. I would request the gentlemen to please unveil the conversation, and we must go ahead with a round of applause.
Friends, it's indeed a delight to be back at the Bhopal Literary Fest on its 2nd day. Vikram and I just now were saying off stage that 2 Kannadigas are meeting for the first time in Bhopal. Though both of us have lived in Bengaluru for many years, we have never had a chance to interact, though I have followed his writings quite keenly. It's, I think, a book which is truly, truly worthy of a very, very detailed discussion. Both the way the author has written the book and the theme on which the book is, both, I think, merit a lot of attention. I just had a discussion with Vikramji. What we will do is, we will start it off as a conversation between us and then open up the whole theme for discussion. Now, this book of Vikram, which is titled Savarkar, a Contested Legacy. And I would start my conversation with Vikram on the subtitle of the book itself. That we are referring to in this book about a contested legacy. But is that not something we in today's world are consistently talking about? We are in a world of binaries, where you are either a supporter of Patel having been the Prime Minister or whether Nehru was a better Prime Minister. Are we in a world of binaries where if Savarkar is correct, then Gandhi is wrong, and if Gandhi is correct, Savarkar is wrong? And can it not be that both have their own perspectives and both are right in some ways? So that is for me as a student of politics, the binaries and the contested legacy that I would like to focus on. Vikram, to start off with, I would like to quote you at one particular place in your book, on page 498, when you talk of Savarkar's statement in the court on his relationship with Godse, where you say Savarkar refers to Godse as a casual acquaintance. And you go on to say that possibly someone was being economical with the truth. Now, with that as a contested legacy to start off with, I would also raise two incidents. In 1924, when he was released, the British called it a quiet triumph because he decided, he promised to desist from political activity. In 1935, he sought a release of that restriction on the ground of the Majesty's birthday celebration. Later in 1950, he again agreed to be released if he were to retire from public life. In your own book, you quote Savarkar, who says, "I am consistent with ideology, I alter my tactics." So are these 2-3 examples a reflection of that? That would be my first set of issues.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Shastri. A very good evening to everyone. It's always such a great pleasure to be at the Bhopal Literature Festival. This is my second occasion to be here. The last time was the first volume, Echoes from a Forgotten Past, which covered the first half of this very, very contentious figure's life. Dr. Shastri, I think that was a great way to begin. And the very fact, contested legacy is what you question. As a political analyst, sometimes I wonder when you are on election analysis and so on, are we all fighting elections in the 21st century, or are we fighting it in the 15, 16, 17? Because the characters who form part of the narrative in election rallies and speeches, right from the Mughals and Aurangzeb and Tipu Sultan to Gandhi to Jinnah, I mean, today's problems, today's issues seldom get discussed as much as history becomes a live battlefield in today's politics. In that sense, I think Savarkar is one figure whom I believe, intrudes contemporary political discourse like very few characters of the past do. He polarizes opinion, either this way or that way. There it doesn't seem to be a middle ground at all. You're absolutely right when you said, Patel and Nehru, Ambedkar and Gandhi, Ambedkar and Nehru, all these are the different schisms of our modern political history. But with Savarkar, there is no chance also of a middle ground. Either he's completely white or completely black without the 50 shades of gray in between that all of us as human beings, I think, have. And so you have someone like a Rahul Gandhi who's, in election rallies, he's mocking him, for which he gets a defamation suit from Savarkar's grandnephew. The Prime Minister then goes to cellular jail, pays his respects at the place where Savarkar was incarcerated for 12 long years, at Kalapani. The Chhattisgarh government, the Rajasthan government, all the non-BJP governments spend a lot of valuable public time and energy to decide whether the Veer needs to be prefixed to his name or it should not. So in the midst of all this noise, if a young people like this who are in the audience want to actually know what is all this hullabaloo about this man all about, what is it that what is it that causes all this angst among people? Sadly, the last book that was written on him was way back in the 1960s when he was still, around. Dhananjay Keer's, comprehensive biography of his. Since then and now, 2019, when my first volume came, we've had innumerable biographies of Gandhi and Nehru and so many other people. But he somehow escaped a kind of a scrutiny, someone who, as I said, intrudes today's discussion, someone whose ideology, Hindutva, is in the political ascendant today, is so relevant today. His thoughts are relevant, whether this way or that way, whether you like it or not. despite that, the very lack of academic interest in the man to kind of understand his thoughts and views, I think that is what really, pushed me into this 5-year-long journey to kind of wrap my head against this man of multiple contradictions. And the contestations of his legacy are multifold. One is, of course, what you mentioned. Today all the time, the discussion is, was he a Maafi Veer? Did he ask for mercy in his so-called petitions, which were petitions? They were not mercy petitions. They were petitions which were a very common legal recourse that several people had. Did he turn to become a stooge of the British? Was he, someone who was acting on their behalf? If he were, then I argue in the book that he would not have been put under house arrest for 13 long years. Even after his release from Kala Pani, the British would have co-opted him into the government process. Then, of course, as you rightly mentioned, that very, very difficult phase of Gandhi's assassination, in which he was implicated, but later on, of course, honorably exonerated. But there was one letter that Sardar Patel writes to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, where he says, your leader, Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, belonged to the Hindu Mahasabha, of which Savarkar was the president. So Mukherjee writes a letter to Patel saying, he's sacrificed so much for the country, so be a little kind to him. Let's don't put him to torture at this age and stage of his life. And Patel says something very interesting, that, legally he may get exonerated, but the moral albatross is something that may still, something that he'll have to carry. And unfortunately, that's what is happening even to this day. The moral taint, so to say, of that association with Godse or with the murder of Gandhi, though courts have exonerated him, every time there's a discussion about whether you need to give the Bharat Ratna to him or not, these points keep coming out as very important contestations. And so I think that's very relevant for today's political discourse, in addition to being a historical, discussion as well.
Vikram, if I could move on to a second point. You highlight in the book what Savarkar calls the 4 pillars of his social reform, the whole 4 foundations of the social reform, which were persuade Orthodox Hindus to reform, abolish untouchability, expose the myth of homogeneous society among Muslims and Christians. Yeah. This whole debate that those societies are equal, undo that myth, and finally, lead by example. Now, if you look at all the 4 pillars, there are important nuggets of anecdotes which you provide in the book. But I would like to focus on the 4th, which is lead by example. How much would you endorse the point that a lot of people said Savarkar was essentially a rationalist? When his wife passed away, he said the body should not be brought home, take it straight to the crematorium.
No
he
shraddh.
said no ritual should be done, no shraddh, no rituals. Though, of course, I believe quietly his son did it without or with the father's knowledge, and the father said that's his right to do what he wanted. When he passed away, he made it very clear I should be taken to an electric crematorium, no fire-based cremation, and no rituals again after my passing away. So we associate what many people would today call an icon of Hindu nationalism with intense rationalism, which is not associated, where you take a position away from religion. Do you see that similarity in only that aspect with Jinnah, who is also seen as an icon of Muslim fundamentalism, but for no practical purposes actually practiced that religion in his life? I would want you to focus on the larger.
Yes. So, in terms of religion, ritualistically, I think he was anti-ritual. But then, deeply, I wouldn't call him an atheist. Nirishwarvad, it's a very difficult thing to translate into English. Maybe agnosticism is what he, propounded. But then, very much, to Nehru. So it's a gray area. So very much, in the realm of, as you rightly said, rational thinking. That famous episode comes to mind. I think 1934, when there was an earthquake in Bihar. Gandhiji actually said, the earthquake is a result of the curse of God, because we are following the caste system. And Savarkar all the time had this running feud with Gandhiji. He would write editorials against him. I think he stalked him in today's parlance on social media. You stalk someone. This man was constantly stalking Gandhi to see what he's writing on various issues from Hindu.
Much earlier, this will be part of your first book. Because I have taught Savarkar for many years as a teacher of politics. I remember in London that famous episode
Yes.
where Savarkar and Gandhi met at Savarkar's home. And Savarkar's favorite dinner very often used to be fish and chips.
Prawn, yeah.
And Gandhi arrived there and Savarkar said, would you like to share my dinner? He said, nahi, I am a vegetarian. And then Savarkar, I believe, jokingly told him, you don't want to eat this dead fish, how do you deal with the live British alligator in India? You see, that was the response that he came up with.
Yeah. So in many of these things, he was constantly on a war path with Gandhi. So when this earthquake happened and Gandhi said this, he writes in the Shraddhanand that he was editing, that if someone like Gandhi is, who's a leader of the masses, if he's pandering to such superstitions, what would happen of the common masses? On the one hand, you had the Shankaracharya who was saying that the earthquake happened because we were trying to dismantle the caste system. On the other hand, you had Gandhi saying that the earthquake happened because, we were following the caste system. So what is God really doing? And in fact, what you said was so true. In fact, they met also a couple of times. In the second instance, when they met in London again at the India House, it's during Dashera, and all of them are asked to speak something. And Gandhi said, I'm not going to talk about anything about politics. I'll talk about Ram Rajya and the esoteric nature of the ideal state. And immediately after that, and the importance of ahimsa. And the fundamental difference between these two men came to the fore there in 1909, where immediately after Gandhi spoke, Savarkar comes to stage and says, even to establish Ram Rajya, Ram had to go and kill Ravan. He didn't go and sit in Satyagraha in front of Ravan and ask him to release Sita. And he says, we are in the midst of Dashera, where on the 9 days, we are celebrating the goddess with all her astra and shastra that she has. And this philosophy of complete non-violence, absolute non-violence or ahimsa, according to him, was something that was very un-Indian. It was almost Tolstoyan, it was almost Christian in its nature, because all our gods and goddesses are shown with weapons in their hands. And annihilation of evil is considered a very legitimate task. Even Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita says, even if the opponent is your father or guru or whoever else, if he's on the side of adharma, you need to annihilate him. So something on this front, both of them differed, but on several other issues, as you rightly mentioned, the cow not being worthy of worship, according to the father of Hindutva. Today, what would that lead to on the streets of hinterland of India? We shudder to think. And rationality on every aspect. So actually Savarkar would be a great poster boy of the so-called liberals of India. Unfortunately, due to his association with Hindutva, whatever, and a warped idea of what that Hindutva is, he's made to be a fall guy.
Vikram, my last point of conversation before I open it up to the audience. I find very fascinating when reading about Savarkar, the Gandhi, Ambedkar, Savarkar relationship. The point that Savarkar once makes when Ambedkar talks about, I will not die a Hindu. It's not in that context, but in another context, Savarkar says, don't to the what later came to be called the scheduled castes. He said, don't threaten to leave Hinduism. Don't threaten to leave Hinduism, because Hinduism is not the preserve of the upper castes. So I would want you to reflect on, for the benefit of this audience, the difference between Savarkar and Ambedkar in terms of how they looked at this fight for equality in Hindu society. And the second, and something very complex, which I think a lot of people have not written, the relationship between Savarkar and Dr. Shyama Prakash Mukherjee. I'm just going to quote 4 incidents. When Mukherjee agrees for that talks with Jinnah, and Savarkar says it should not happen, but I leave it to you. When ultimately Mukherjee takes over the presidency of the Mahasabha, And Mukherjee is delivering his first speech as the president of the Mahasabha. Parallelly, Savarkar has gone outside and is delivering another speech outside. And later on, the criticism comes that Mukherjee's speech could very well be a speech given by a president of the Congress party. Thirdly, when there is violence in Bengal, Dr. Mukherjee says, I want to save all Bengalis. Whereas Savarkar says the focus needs to be on looking at protecting the Hindus. And finally, on joining the government. Correct me if I'm wrong, Savarkar took the stand, I am nobody to stop you from entering the government, but my own personal views on this are very different. So it's very interesting, these two tall leaders of the Mahasabha, his successor as the president, that relationship. So if you could spend a few minutes on both these issues, the Savarkar-Ambedkar relationship and the Shama Prakash Mukherjee relationship, that would give a lot of insights to our audience on the persona of Savarkar.
Sure. So the Ambedkar-Savarkar relationship is very complicated according to me because, Ambedkar writes a very laudatory letter to Savarkar once saying, you're the only one who has understood the fact that the Varna system is at the root cause of the whole Jativad, and we need to call for a dismantling of the entire Varnashram system itself if caste has to be annihilated. And why he was making that distinction was around the same time, a group of so-called untouchables go to Gandhi and talk about, this is around 1932-34, and Gandhi says, everyone cannot become a viceroy or a prime minister. You need to be born in a particular family. Leadership qualities come hereditary. So you cannot aspire to become a leader. So quite an antithesis of what a democracy actually is. So, and Gandhi and Ambedkar had this constant feud with each other when it came to what they looked at eradication of caste evils. Ambedkar's ruse was Gandhi was just looking at, piecemeal reforms in terms of removal of untouchability, whereas he believed in the Varna system because Gandhi had said that I think that the Varna system is the bedrock of Hinduism and I don't consider it as odious. If it is shaken, then the entire edifice of Hinduism will come crumbling, on which they had a feud. So I would say Savarkar and Ambedkar were ideologically a lot more, closer to each other when it came to caste than before, of course, Ambedkar decided to convert to Buddhism. But then very interestingly, all the time Savarkar said in the 13 years that he was house arrested in Ratnagiri, he conducted a series of social reforms. Then very interesting. Your earlier question, which, I didn't answer as much in detail, the intercaste dining, the first ever cafe in India where people of all castes could sit together and eat at a time when, among the Maharashtrian Brahmins, the Deshasthas and the Chitpavans would not sit together and eat. Intercaste marriage, the first temple in India in 1931 called the Patipavan Mandir, where people of all castes and communities could go and pray, was something that Savarkar started there. And his 7 shackles of Hindu society that he spoke of, Vedokta Bandi, the Vedas are free universal knowledge. It's not the preserve only of one upper class community. So it needs to be universalized to everyone. Vyavasai Bandi, hereditariness of a profession is something that he opposed. It's only through merit. Shuddhi Bandi, if someone has gone out of the fold of Hinduism, you need to allow them back. There is no scheme of conversion and proselytization in Hinduism. So can we allow for Shuddhi? Sparsha Bandi, complete annihilation of untouchability. Samudra Bandi, loss of caste if you actually go out across the seas, that was something he was opposed. In fact, he always said, get into the enemy's camp, Shatru ke shibir mein jaake, you understand their tactics and come back and hit them in the way it hurts the most. And then Roti Bandi and Beti Bandi, intercaste dining, intercaste marriage. So these were very path-breaking reforms, and he would all the time write to Ambedkar literally with pleas, saying, I have been restricted only in Ratnagiri. So my association, whatever I've done here is like a pilot project. So why don't you come here and see with your own eyes what we have done? You are a free man. You can replicate this across the country. And, if we work together in 10 years, we can get rid of not only untouchability, but also caste system as a whole in India. But Ambedkar never, shared stage with Savarkar all through those 13 years, only because I think there was a stigma attached to him, right? Like it is now. Anybody who is associated with him, who writes about him, has to face a lot of turmoil in their lives. So I think
also that you come to my place or will I come to your place, because this debate is
also there. But with these two men, I think both were Maharashtrians. They spoke the same language. They came from the same milieu. So they could have met. But I think Ambedkar all the time kept giving some excuse. But he had a sympathy, it seems, to him. Like there's another instance I quote in the book where, Ambedkar was a law minister. And when Savarkar was implicated in Mahatma Gandhi's assassination, he actually calls up Savarkar's advocate, Bhopatkar, and says, I want to meet you. And then Ambedkar himself is driving the car. It's at Mathura Road somewhere in Delhi. And he asks Bhopatkar to hop into the car. And then he tells him that, the case against your client is so flimsy. It's a fixed case. And I am telling you this as a law minister of this nation, that at the highest, echelons of power, he has been fixed. And the cabinet is also divided deeply on this. Even Patel had his differences with the prime minister and so on. But then your client will come out of it unscathed, is what he's supposed to have said, Bhopatkar. And he even attended the Red Fort trials for the Gandhi murder, especially when Savarkar was making his deposition several times. So they had a very, very tenuous relationship. On the one hand, he had his sympathies for him, but didn't want to be publicly acknowledged, which I think, as I said, is the problem for anyone who's associated with Savarkar. They want to, including the current government. I mean, it takes the current Prime Minister a signature on a piece of paper to award the Bharat Ratna to him. But then the association with Savarkar, you will imbibe his ideology, you will venerate him, but you will not go the whole hog to appropriate him. That seems to be... What do you say about Mukherjee? Yes. Mukherjee and Savarkar too, and I bring that out as one of the failings of Savarkar as a leader, where in a small party, the Hindu Mahasabha, so many factions that were there, he failed to control that. And you had a very strong Bengal faction, and you had the Maharashtra faction. So Godse and Apte and all of these people who were diehard Maharashtrian, Savarkarites, they were staunchly opposed to the almost Congress-wearing, as you rightly mentioned, Congress-wearing kind of philosophies of Mukherjee. In fact, Gandhiji had once said that Patel is the best Hindu Mahasabha leader in the Congress and Shama Prasad Mukherjee is the best Congress leader in the Hindu Mahasabha. So he was, I think, talking about a lot of things very similar to what the Congress was demanding, like, civil disobedience, mass movements, all of it Savarkar was not completely for. He was open to negotiations with the Viceroy, especially during the run-up to the Quit India and the Second World War and all of that. So they had those differences between them. But at the same time, I think Mukherjee had this sympathy for his leader. But people around him, I think, to a large extent, they fanned the differences so much. You had the North Indian caucus and the Bengal caucus of the Hindu Mahasabha, which formed one group opposing the Maharashtra caucus, and eventually Mukherjee became the president. And even on his joining the government, actually Savarkar had no issues with that. He said, we need a voice in the government of the Mahasabha as well. But it became so untenable for Mukherjee to continue in the government or continue in the Mahasabha, because constantly Nehru and Patel were putting so much pressure on him to disassociate from Savarkar and his philosophy. And ultimately, Mukherjee threw up his arms and formed the Jan Sangh and distanced himself completely from the Mahasabha.
I think now I would like to open up the discussion to the audience. And yes, we have a lot of hands coming up. And I would prefer to be left here rather than right. And let me start with our young man in the front here.
Sir,
Yes.
Namaste, sir.
Namaste.
And I feel that you are the most best person who can defend us from the leftist historians.
God.
And I have watched the video which was there with you on Aditya Mukherjee on Savarkar, and that was the best video made.
Thank you.
And sir, I will ask you that on 1940, Savarkar and Subhash Chandra Bose met, and somewhere in R.C. Agrawal's book, I have listened that the INA, Indian National Army, was the product of Savarkar's mind, and he suggested Subhash Chandra Bose that you may go and outside and make National Army. So, sir, this one is right or wrong? And sir, I have another question.
I'm
That-
so sorry, but we have a lot of hands
So
coming
I
up.
last
Just one.
one.
Keep your question precise. One question.
Yes.
One question at a
Sir,
time.
we see that Dr. Ambedkar also wrote about Purna Bhumi and Islamophobic materials, and he's not criticized for that, and Savarkar is criticized for these things. So please clear both of these questions.
Thank you.
This is again a very, all the time this is invoked, Bose and Savarkar. They were political opponents. So many people, even recently when Bose's statue came up at the India Gate, you had these memes that were doing the rounds in social media where Bose had very uncharitable things to say about the Hindu Mahasabha, which was true. I mean, he was in the Congress, it was a political rival, but at the same time, Bose also was trying to negotiate an alliance with the Hindu Mahasabha in the Calcutta municipal polls in 1939 or so, just before he left India. When that failed, he actually formed an alliance with the Muslim League. But his public quotes, he said both of these are communal parties and so on. So like today, politicians say some things, for electoral politics, they do other things. So we shouldn't think that these leaders of the past were some saints who were very different from what kind of leaders today are to form governments, arithmetic, all of that is necessary. So they had these differences. But then it is said, so Bose was literally hounded out of the Congress, and that is when he formed the Forward Bloc, and he wanted to do a civil disobedience movement all over India. And he went to Jinnah, he went to Savarkar asking for support, and somewhere in June 1940 is when he met Savarkar at his home. And the discussions lasted for several hours. It is said it was a secret meeting. No one really knows what actually happened. But during his, Savarkar's secretary, however, compiles the entire discussion where Savarkar is supposed to have shown Bose the letters that were exchanged between Rash Bihari Bose and himself. And Rash Bihari Bose was the one who founded the INA, and he was sitting in Japan and trying to lead an armed struggle against the British Raj. So he said there's no point doing yet another civil disobedience movement. It has failed in the past, it will fail again. So Shatru ka Shatru dost hota hai, so you go away outside India and form an alliance with the Axis powers, Germany, and then later on Japan and so on. So 6 months later, quite coincidentally, Bose leaves India in January 1941 from his home, first goes to Germany, even meets Hitler, is disillusioned, then he's called to Southeast Asia by Rash Bihari Bose, who founded the Azad Hind Fauj, and passes on the baton to Bose, who's now called Netaji. While I would not say it was completely Savarkar's brainchild that caused him to, that is a little bit of an exaggeration by a lot of Savarkar fans too, but then an inspiration was most certainly there, because the Rash Bihari Bose and Savarkar connection was very close. Right from 1937, Rash Bihari was writing eulogizing letters to him, saying, "You are the rising leader of a new India." He had formed a speech that he made. Yeah, Savarkar had made a speech in Bombay in 1937, and that had found its way to Japan. And Rash Bihari Bose was so enamored by this and said, "You're the only one who understands how to throw the British out, which is through the armed struggle." And so that is one reason he also founded the Hindu Mahasabha chapter in Japan. So there was a lot of that connection. So we can probably connect the dots and make conjectures. We cannot be sure. The second thing was about... well, yes, become Islam, yeah. So yes, I mean, when people say Savarkar was an Islamophobe, I mean, the kind of writings that Baba Sahab also wrote, that is completely concealed. He said Hindus and Muslims cannot live together as one country. We need a complete separation of populations. Islam, distinguishes the world into Darul Islam and Darul Harab. These two cannot live together, all kinds of things like that. But these aspects of his writings are not brought out because of the political currency, I think, that Ambedkar has today. He's appropriated by political parties, by castes and communities, and so it becomes very difficult to point fingers at him, because immediately your effigies will get burnt. But then Savarkar can be castigated as much as you want.
So the mic is not on.
Is it also about the wider context of a leader? Like whenever reference is made to Ambedkar and Ambedkarites, it's generally seen in the context of caste system, annihilation of caste, fight for the untouchables, providing reservation. Because if you push it forward, Ambedkar was one of the strongest opponents of local government, of Panchayati Raj.
Because of
he
the
called
political
it
currency.
cesspool of corruption, dens of casteism. But today, if you see the whole movement, we see Panchayati Raj as the way to provide support for the backward caste. So I think what happens is a leader gets associated with a particular frame of politics. And Ambedkar got associated with that frame of politics. Whereas Savarkar got associated with another frame of politics, where it was useful to talk of this particular dimension because it fitted in perfectly with that frame of politics. I wouldn't know if you would agree.
True, I agree completely.
So shall we move on to the next question? Yes, gentleman in the front. And please, I request everyone to please keep your questions crisp.
मेरा नाम अभिषेक सिंह है. मैं ये पूछना चाहता हूँ कि सावरकर को देखने वाली दृष्टि में प्रॉब्लम है कि सावरकर का प्रॉब्लम है. When we look, बहुत सारे लोग जो सावरकर के फेवर में हैं या सावरकर के खिलाफ हैं. तो सावरकर ने भविष्य नहीं देखा था, बट भूत की तरफ देखते हुए हम अपने को जस्टिफाई करने की कोशिश करते हैं. क्या ऐसा हो सकता है कि कोई व्यक्ति या तो बहुत ही अच्छा हो या बहुत खराब हो, तो लोग फ्रेम करते हैं, अपने विचारों को फ्रेम करते हैं, तो इस पे क्या टेक है आपका? थैंक यू.
बहुत ही अच्छा सवाल है. तो जैसा मैंने पहले ही कहा कि इनको इतना पोलराइज कर दिया गया है कि या तो इनसे आप बेहद प्रेम करें कि वो उनको बढ़ा चढ़ा के उनकी अतिशयोक्ति इतना हम करते रहें कि वो जो उन्होंने कहा वो सही है, ऐसा भी हम कहने वाला एक गुट है. और दूसरा एक गुट है जो इनकी हर वक्तव्य को तोड़ मरोड़ के उनको एक डेमोनाइजेशन, जो दानव की तरह उनको दर्शाते हैं, ये भी एक तबका है हमारे पास. तो आई थिंक द रियलिटी ऑफ हिस्ट्री, लाइक वी डिस्कस्ड, आर दो शेड्स ऑफ ग्रे इन बिटवीन, कि देयर वर क्वालिटीज विच वर फार अहेड ऑफ हिज टाइम्स, लाइक दिस होल जाति निर्मूलन का जो उनका प्लान था, या फिर राष्ट्र सुरक्षा के बारे में उनके जो विचार थे. बार बार वो ग्लोबल पॉलिटिक्स और जियो पॉलिटिक्स में इतना वो ही वाज इंटीग्रेटेड कि ऑलमोस्ट दूसरे विश्व युद्ध के 10 साल पहले ही उन्होंने प्रेडिक्शन कर दिया था कि देयर विल बी अ ग्लोबल कन्फ्लैग्रेशन इन द वर्ल्ड 10 साल के बाद. और पहले विश्व युद्ध में तो हमने वी मिस द बस. तो इस बार हमें किसी भी हालत में इसको वी शुड नॉट लेट इट पास एंड वी शुड मेक एडवांटेज ऑफ दैट इन इंडिया. आफ्टर इंडिपेंडेंस टू चाइना के बारे में उन्होंने बहुत सारे वक्तव्य दिए कि हिंदी चीनी भाई भाई और पंचशील के बारे में आप बहुत ज़्यादा बी कॉशियसली ऑप्टिमिस्टिक बिकॉज चाइना इज अ प्रेडेटरी पावर अकॉर्डिंग टू हिम, विच ही रोट ओपनली. नॉर्थ ईस्ट में जो डेमोग्राफिक चेंजेस आ रहे थे उससे राष्ट्रीय सुरक्षा को जो खतरे और चुनौतियां आने वाली थी उसके बारे में भी उन्होंने देश को आगाह किया था. तो ऐसे बहुत सारे उनके क्वालिटीज थे जो दूरगामी थे. एट द सेम टाइम उनका एक और प्रॉब्लम ये भी था कि वो ही वॉज ड्वेलिंग अ लॉट इन द पास्ट, आई थिंक विच वी आर ऑल्सो टुडे ऑल द टाइम. एज शुरू में ही कहा था कि हर चुनाव में हम मुगल्स और इनके बारे में ही बात करते रहते हैं, पर इनके भी जो 6 गोल्डन इपॉक्स जो किताब उन्होंने अपने जिंदगी के अंत में लिखी थी, उसमें इट वाज ऑल अबाउट द इन्वेजन्स एंड हाउ अ ट्रूथ एंड रिकंसिलिएशन कमीशन के बारे में जो हम आज बात करते हैं, किस तरह से वी हैव टू मेक पीस विथ आवर पास्ट and which has not happened, and that was a direct contrast to the Nehruvian consensus on what history should be, कि हम जो पुराने घाव हैं उनको भूल जाएं और एक नया भविष्य तैयार करें. पर इनका मानना था कि जब तक पुराने घावों को पूरी तरह से हील नहीं किया जाता तब तक हम आगे बढ़ नहीं पाते. वो अंदर ही अंदर इट विल बी अ कैंकर विच विल ग्रो, अ कैंसर, एंड वी हैव टू इरेडिकेट इट फ्रॉम द रूट्स फॉर अस टू मूव फॉरवर्ड एज अ नेशन एंड अ सोसाइटी.
छोटी बात इस सर के प्रश्न पे मुझे याद आ रहा है. क्या ये होता है कि इतिहास में जो जो व्यक्ति हमारे सामने आए हैं, हम उनके नजरिया के उनके जीवन को नहीं देखते, हमारे नजरिया से उनके जीवन को देखते हैं. सो क्या होता है, हमारा कंक्लूजन फिक्स्ड है, उसके लिए फिर हम एविडेंस ढूंढते हैं. विक्रम ने ये नहीं किया. Vikram is a very honorable exception to that.
उसके लिए
But
actually
see, I've seen in a lot of places, I have a conclusion which I want to draw. So now let me search for evidence to defend that conclusion. आज भी यही चर्चा हो रही है. We are talking of my history and your history. Nobody is talking about our history. You see? See, मेरा इतिहास, आपका इतिहास, हमारा इतिहास कहाँ गया इसमें? And I think that's where there has to be a change in our perspective in terms of not looking at your perspective, my perspective, but how do we together take it forward? I don't know if Vikram would endorse that.
I would endorse it, but then my detractors don't. The problem is, one of the criticism is, you have relied a lot on Savarkar's, self-narratives. मैं कहता हूँ भैया अगर सावरकर जी का जीवनी लिखना है तो उनके खुद के विचार पहले
अच्छे हिस्टोरियन की तरह उनको कोट किया है एंड एक अच्छा परसेप्टिव रीडर देखें तो they can read between the lines
Yeah.
in what you have said.
yes
Like
without
especially when I
saying
quoted again, he was being economical with the truth. Now this is what Vikram says about Savarkar, that he was being economical. So if you, this is a huge book to read, and I have lot of jottings here. Now if you, there are between the lines statements which Vikram makes, and I'm sure he has spent a lot of time writing this. Those between the lines statements are a reflection of how you can go beyond accepted rhetoric on issues.
Yes, next question from the student in the front line.
Good evening, sir. My name is Sandeep Shastri, and I'm a student of Jagaran Lake City University. So, sir, there is an argument about V.D. Savarkar that since he opposed the Quit India movement, that's why many people argue that he was loyalist to the Britishers, and after 1911, he did not vehemently criticize the Britishers. So do you see any similarity, or do you think that this is a right notion about Savarkar, that since he was not part of Quit India movement, that's why he was not against the Britishers?
I'll answer it in two parts. One is after he got released. He got released in 1924 on two conditions. One is he would abstain from politics and he would be restricted to Ratnagiri in Maharashtra. So overtly he could not participate in politics. But this restriction on politics abstinence was for 5 years. But every time his case came up for a review at the end of 5 years, the British government's records, which I quote here, they clearly say we cannot trust this man. He has dubious underground links with what they call the terrorist organizations, who are our revolutionaries. So whether it was Chandrasekhar Azad or Bhagat Singh or Sukhdev, Rajguru, Durga Bhabi, Sachindranath Sanyal, Rash Bihari Bose, the Savarkar brothers had a constant touch with all of them. It was a Jekyll and Hyde. By day you were a social reformer, but underground you were also dealing with all these people, and that is one reason, like I mentioned earlier too, if he had sold his soul to the British, he was a very useful fellow. I mean, he was a law educated from London. The British would have easily taken him over to their side, and especially when government started getting formed after 1937, he would have probably been the Prime Minister of Bombay State. But the very fact that till the very end, the British did not trust, his credentials, is proof of the fact that, he was not, completely pro-British. He's not a stooge of the British. Now, about the Quit India part, now, you see, there also I dwell a lot of detail on this very difficult aspect. You had the Cripps mission that came in February, March 1942 that failed. That led to a lot of dissensions within the Congress. You had Nehru and Maulana Azad who were very much pro the Cripps mission, because Nehru wanted to become the first defense minister of India. It was almost certain that he was going to become the defense minister under the viceroy. But then Gandhi is said to have thrown a spanner in the works, and the Cripps mission failed. Now, Gandhi's role by then in the Congress was somewhat waning. And to relaunch himself, and this is not something I'm saying, but a lot of congressmen, including Maulana Azad, who was the president of the Congress, criticized the Quit India movement, saying this was launched with zero planning. This had no clear objectives as to what you wanted to make the British give you. And there was no, strategy that the whole movement had. It was launched on 9th of August 1942, and within a week, the entire Congress top brass was in jail, including Gandhi. And so in the absence of leadership, this do or die meant different things to different people. It actually became the most violent movement also, with underground forces, insurrection. was rescinded. Here you had, in comparison, quite a violent movement. So many people, Maulana Azad himself had opposition to the Quit India movement. Ambedkar, gave out a call during Quit India that participating in it is a treachery to the nation. Anybody who takes part in Quit India is a traitor, so you should stay away from it. And particularly at a time when Japan was threatening to strike at the borders of India during the Second World War, to create this kind of a, strategy-less movement was something that many people were opposed to, and the Hindu Mahasabha and Savarkar were also opposed to. But yet again, like the earlier question, if Ambedkar had also said that, he is not called, a traitor for saying anybody who doesn't participate in this is anti-national. But then Savarkar gets, and in fact, the Congress itself, they called it August disturbances. It was called the Quit India movement much later. So they disowned themselves from this movement. Gandhiji, in fact, after coming out of the Aga Khan Palace, he apologized for the movement and said, we will not launch any more movements. We will now cooperate with the government in the future terms. So in later mythology, I think this has become such an important aspect of the Congress version of history, whereas the Congress itself had, distanced themselves from the movement to a large extent.
Okay. IAS Officer Tejasvi Nayak ji has a question. So one by one, please.
Hi, Vikram. I'm Tejasvi Nayak.
You were supposed to be here in the middle.
yeah, but I think it's better I'm here. I'm just watching. Before I ask my question, I have to wonder, how do you come out with such huge books? I have 3 of them, all by you, and I have gone through all of them. Reading them itself is an achievement. Now, I don't understand, at such a young age, you have come out with so many books, and now I have seen a latest book also in the bookstall, so which is going to be made into a movie. Yeah, coming to the question, the freedom struggle against the British, though it was a pan-India thing, there are identified certain regional flavors to it also. Yeah, the British themselves have, pointed it out. As you also mentioned, the Bengal thing, the Punjab thing, and then there comes the pan-Maharashtra thing. Because you have come out with such huge voluminous book on Savarkar, you have also gone behind that thought process also. What made Savarkar? What do you have to say about this pan-Maharashtra thing? There is a certain flavor to it which is different. So I would want to hear from you about it. Yeah. Thank you.
Sure. About the weight of the book, if you've said reading it has been an achievement, I would take it as a compliment that it has been readable enough that you've managed to finish it. This whole, I always say, we've been presented a very simplistic, monochromatic, linear kind of a narrative to our freedom struggle, like that Attenborough film. And the song that is drilled into our psyche is "De di hame azadi bina khadg bina bhal sabarmati ke sant tune kar diya kamal," which is great. I mean, I'm not disparaging for once the importance of the mass movement of Gandhiji, but to say that that was the cause completely for our freedom undermines, I think, a very important parallel struggle that was going on in this country, of a continuous struggle of an armed rebellion. And this had its roots in 1857. Before that, of course, you had all the tribal revolts, Birsa Munda, so many others from different parts of the country. But 1857 was a culmination. From 1857 to 1946, and 1857 was a very important milestone in the mind of a Savarkar, who actually christened the term the First War of Indian Independence. From there to 1946, which ideally should be called the last war of Indian independence and not naval mutiny as it is still called, you had different parts of India participating, sometime in cohesion, sometimes separately. Bengal, Maharashtra, Punjab, United Provinces, parts of Tamil Nadu, so many places which became hotbeds of what the British would call sedition and treason. And this never stopped. So how is it presented to us in our history books particularly, is that these were chhotput ghatna idhar udhar ho gayi. They were hot-blooded young men who threw one bomb here and there. assassinated someone, then phansi pe chad gaye, and that's it. But the bulk of the narrative is the mass movement is how we are taught. But the underlining philosophy of the revolutionary movement was, can we in some way create an insurrection in the British Indian Army? Because by the time of the Second World War, you had about 2.5 million Indian soldiers in the war, controlled by about 40,000 overlords of the Europeans. Now, out of this 2.5 million, even if a small percent, 10%, 5%, whatever, are seduced to patriotism and they are brought over to the side of fighting for the country, the edifice of the British Empire would come crumbling, and that would happen very, very quickly. That was what they believed in, and that's what eventually happened, whether it was the INA and so on. And particularly in Maharashtra, right from the 1870s, you had people like Vasudev Balwant Phadke, the Chafekar brothers, Tilak, and his role in creating these imageries around the Ganesha festival or Shivaji Jayanti and so on. So Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj as this icon who was fighting for freedom against the foreigner, though that may have been the Mughal, but still very, very potent symbolism. Now in all of this, the Hindu-ness of those icons, whether it was Bankim Chandra in Bengal or, the whole Vande Mataram, or the looking of India as Bharat Mata, as an incarnation of Durga, the various verses of, the Vande Mataram, which is like a shloka to the mother goddess. Or in Maharashtra, you had Bhavani, who was Shivaji's, the deity, favorite deity, or Chandi in Punjab. So this whole raw energy, the raw power, the Hindu iconography of our freedom struggle, today we can't talk about it openly because that will be called as being communal. But then these factors were very much a part of an inspiration for several of these, freedom fighters. In fact, when I was researching for this book at the British Library in London, I managed to see a lot of these proscribed material, pamphlets and so on. And one image which really sticks in my mind is, there's Bharat Mata standing there and she's demanding all these, Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Rajguru, Chandrasekhar Azad are standing in front. They have cut off their heads and they're giving it as an offering to her and she's accepting it. And there's blood oozing out. It's almost like the Chinnamasta Devi, which one of the Dash Mahavidyas. This was the iconography which really, shook me there, that this was what was being circulated among people. So the Hindu-ness of the freedom struggle, which we somehow feel very bashful about, that was not the case when these people were actually there. And Savarkar too was greatly influenced by those Hindu ideals too, which were very much a part of the revolutionary zeal, where Chandi and Durga and all the Ugra roop of the Devi in particular was something that most of them were drawn to.
Okay, we'll take one last question. Please keep it
short
short and
very
simple.
short, sir.
Same for the answer.
I am non-Kannadiga Bangalorean, sir. Stayed in Bangalore for 19 years. My question, I met sir in Bangalore in Murugesh Palyam also during Bangalore Film Festival, then Bangalore Literary Festival. So my question to you, sir, that Savarkar, Veer Savarkar has not got his due, what was due to him in our after freedom. And second thing, the book he has written, Bharat Ka Swatantrata Sangram, that book I read, and that book was treated like a Bhagavad Gita among the freedom fighters. Until anybody, I would suggest that everyone should read that and will be inspired how India should be in the fight for the freedom struggle. That my question to you, sir, that book, what is your idea about that book, Bharat Ka Swatantrata Sangram? Thank you.
The 1857. So as I mentioned earlier, Savarkar was the first person who called it the first war of Indian independence. Till then, it was being disparaged as Sepoy Mutiny. Again, chutput ghatnaएं, some sipais here and there because they were peeved by the beef cartridges and pork lard and all that. They went on a rampage. That was what the British wanted to do. But 2 years, this man stayed. Shatru ke shibir mein jaake, Shatruncha Shibirat. That was his book, the name of the book of his years in London. Shatru ke shibir mein ghus ke unko maro. I don't know if that resonates with something that happened recently in India as well. Shatru ke shibir mein jaake unko maro. So Shatruncha Shibirat, 2 years he spent at the London archives, used the British documents and wrote this book. And we are in a literature festival, so I must mention that this was the first book probably in the whole world which was proscribed even before it was published. The journey it took to come to light is again very fascinating, because these revolutionaries, they would pack these manuscripts in false bottom boxes and bring it to India, smuggle along with that revolvers and explosives, bomb manuals, how to make bombs and all that. So this manuscript was also brought like that to India, to Savarkar's elder brother Baba Rao. He sent it to a publisher in Sholapur. Uspe police ke chhape pade, and the manuscript was somehow rescued. It was then sent all the way back to London. From there it went to France. In the French police got behind that manuscript. Then it was withdrawn from there. Then it was sent to Germany. And since the book was in Marathi, they thought the Germans were very good at Indology and Sanskrit and all that, so they would manage the Devanagari script. But they made a mess of the typography, so that was withdrawn from Germany. It then went to Belgium, and that was where the book was finally published and then translated by VVS Iyer into English. And this book, as you rightly said, became the Bible, so to say, for revolutionaries all over. In a very, by chance, in the Nehru Memorial Museum, in an oral transcript that I came across, there was this man called Durga Das Khanna, who was a congressman, but in his younger days, he was a revolutionary. In that interview, he said, when I was being recruited by Bhagat Singh to the HSRA, Bhagat Singh asked me, what kind of books do you read, to understand the mind of the young person? And he said, have you read Savarkar's 1857 book and Life of Barrister Savarkar, his autobiography? Some say biography, some say he wrote it in his own name, all kinds of speculations there. So it became very clear that this 1857 book was an entry criteria, so to say, for anyone to go into the HSRA. And 20 years later, Tamil editions, Japanese editions of this book, which were translated and published by the INA, by Rash Bihari Bose, were found in the raids of the INA. So this was, as you rightly said, a very important inspirational book for the revolutionaries. And you're right, I mean, the man needs to be given his due for being the first person who organized the first ever secret society in this country. Someone who organized the first ever student bonfire in this country. When we talk of bonfire, we only think of the Gandhi imagery, but in 1905, he gave this call for Purna Swaraj, complete freedom, during the partition of Bengal, and designed the first flag of independent India, which Madam Bhikaji Kama unfurled at the International Socialist Conference in Stuttgart in 1907. So we may not agree with several of his philosophies, which is fine. I mean, his Hindutva may be something some may agree, some may not agree. But that doesn't take away from the fact that this man was a brave revolutionary, and his contributions to the revolutionary stream of our freedom struggle, which was spoken about, I think that due needs to be given to him in whatever capacity.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. It was indeed a historic session. And now I would like to invite Mr. Abhilash Khandekarji, the founding member of Society for Culture and Environment, to come forward and felicitate our guest author and guest discussant for this session. The memento is a painting based on tribal art which has been made by Padma Shri Bhuribai ji. It's a beautiful painting based on tribal art. It is the official mascot of Bhopal Literature and Art Festival 2022. A tribal painting. A tribal painting made by Padma Shri Bhuribai ji. And a cup along with it to felicitate our discussant for this session, Shastri ji. Zordar taaliyan honi chahiye for both our guests, Sampath ji and Shastri ji. Thank you so much, gentlemen. All of us enjoyed the discussion thoroughly. It was a privilege for us to have you at the Bhopal Literature and Art Festival.